Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, everyone. This is a lectionary podcast from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
I'm Peter Walsh.
And John is away this day, but we're going to try to take on Maundy Thursday together, one of the pivotal Gospels in John and, of course, in Holy Week. So stay tuned at the end of the podcast also for a voicemail on our warm line. And we also have a winner of our t-shirt contest. So at the end, we'll give you some updates on that. So let's get to the text. This is John 13, verses 1 through 17 and 31 through 35. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, you are going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet and put on his robe and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another."
Okay. Yeah, a big piece of scripture. Interestingly, it's always for Maundy Thursday, but it has the option of also trying to understand this in the context of the institution of the Holy Eucharist. And it only comes to us once during the normal Sunday lectionaries. So it's a big piece. And so why don't I start off with the context of it? First of all, we have a parable of love. We have the example, and we have teaching. And the whole story comes to us in a particular context within John's Gospel. Just to review what many of you have been hearing as we've moved through our podcast. The first 12 chapters of John's Gospel are often known as the Book of Signs, or at least chapters 2 through 12, the Book of Signs. And then beginning on chapter 13, where we are now, we get the so-called Book of Glory, or the Book of Jesus' Hour. And just interestingly enough, when we've been talking about the enormous percentage of the Gospels that gets attached to the last week of Jesus' life. In John's Gospel, it's actually the last night of Jesus' life where this gets attached to it. So chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and part of 18 are all in the same night.
Right.
And then obviously 20 and 21 are of resurrection. And what we have here is Jesus' public ministry is over. This is a closed-door session with his team. He's speaking only to his followers. And, of course, we have the beginning of the last discourse that follows this. And finally, the pericope, the passage you just read, actually has a big hunk out of the middle of it.
Right.
The betrayal of Judas and Peter's denial. He predicts that too. So there's the kind of context for it all.
Yeah. Yeah, we get that on Good Friday when we hear the whole big passion.
Yeah.
Interesting, because I do think a lot about Judas in this passage, even though that moment's not there when he betrays Jesus. But I really ponder heavily the fact that Jesus feeds and washes Judas. And, it's part of, you kind of forget he's still in the room when all this is happening since that's gone. But
I think you're right on that. And you've spoken about that in the past, how poignant it is that Jesus is caring for Judas, and the response to Jesus' love is this betrayal that Jesus knows about too. So he's caring about him with all that full knowledge of it. And as you know, it's often understood that the beloved disciple is on one side of him, and it's often painted that Judas is on the other, that he's keeping him that close.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. I think that the foot washing, should we go right into
Sure, absolutely.
The foot washing? It's, I think it's not by accident that Jesus does this while Judas is still there, because he's illustrating something by doing that. I mean, everything Jesus is doing in John is absolutely on purpose and with intention and with some huge meaning around it. He doesn't stumble along and say, this would be a nice gesture.
Right.
It seems so planned and illustrative of everything he's about. It seems to me this is like John's gospel in miniature, the way we talk about Luke 15 and the prodigal son as the gospel in miniature for Luke. I feel like this is John's gospel in miniature, because he's talking about he's giving us an icon really of servanthood. And when he asks them, do you know what I have done to you? I feel like he's as you said, it's a closed session. This is like the final exam, and he really, really wants them to understand. So he literally gets on his feet and puts himself under their feet in this humble position. And of course, as in John, characteristically, there are like 4 or 5 different ways to understand him washing their feet. But with Judas, on the topic of Judas, I feel like that's the way in which it's like this sign of pure servanthood, even, of those whom he thinks he can trust, but knows in the end he can't, and they'll stab him in the back, they'll kick him, and the way Jesus refers to Psalm 41 somewhere, and it's sort of like, even the one who I loved ate my bread, walked in my house, and yet he has stabbed me in the back, or he's actually turned his heel up against me. That's kicking.
Yeah.
So it has this position of being under his feet and being kicked.
Yeah, that is right after the passage, the part that we have in our passage is that quotation from the Psalm. Yeah, I think the way to look at this, in some sense, we get a clue on that when it says, and during supper, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, so that Jesus has full divine authority, full divine power, and he chooses to exercise that in the imitation of the servant. And to serve. And I think that one of the things I'm always attracted to is Jesus, what's happening in Jesus' inner life during all this. And the Jesus that we have, his inner life and the disposition of his inner life at this point is such that he has such clarity of character, such clarity of mission. The hour has come that he is not persuaded or dissuaded by any exterior things that come his way. And one of the ways that we see Jesus in his life is this clarity through which he moves, because he lives his life from the inside out, and that he begins the last discourse, the final discourse, the great discourse, with this act of showing them, just as you said. He acts out what he's about to tell them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. You're right. I feel like he's so self-possessed throughout this whole gospel, and even to the point where in the beginning of this passage he's associating his hour with the Passover, and all that entails and symbolizes for the people. Yeah. And I think for me the overarching context here is that Jesus isn't really coming to, I mean, there is a big question, I think, in this action of Jesus and for all that follows, that is he establishing a new religion here? Because he says, I've given you a new commandment, like a new covenant. And I think the answer is no, because he's coming to sort of redeem the religion of his people to the point where they understand that God doesn't really demand sacrifice. And in his life, he has quoted Hosea, where Hosea says, says God is saying, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And Jesus, in the ultimate gesture, is showing that, look, I'm going to put myself on this altar of your violence and show you how useless it is, and this is what I want. This is how you're to love one another as I have loved you. And that's the new covenant and the new commandment.
Well, you've got.
I think that's a big deal.
Yeah, can I just pull that?
Sorry,
can I pull that in two?
You did.
That's an enormous piece of lamb you just put on the table. That's all done. Boom. So just to talk about the Passover question here first, and then I'd like to talk about the new commandment question and whether or not that's a new religion. So in John's gospel, this is not the Passover Seder as it is in the Synoptic Gospels. It tells us right up front here, now before the festival of the Passover. This is not the Passover. And in John's gospel, Jesus is the Passover lamb in John's gospel. That's the Lamb of God who taketh away the sins of the world. It gets built into our Lenten masses. And that because of that, in John's symbology, Jesus needs to be sacrificed when the Passover lamb would be sacrificed. And so that would be before the Passover Seder, before the Passover meal. So this is a different take on it than in the Synoptic Gospels. And then secondly, the question of I give you a new commandment. Well, there's a lot. I think we should definitely dig into that. I would say I just wanted to clarify that I only
put that all in once because I feel like the Passover for the people is the high point of commemoration and sacrifice for the people. And Jesus is, as you say, using that moment to recast that sacrifice in this way. It's a sacrifice of service and love. Yeah. And anyway, go on.
Yeah,
I wasn't trying to be complete non sequitur about it.
No, and I'm completely with you on the recasting. So even the new commandment, in my understanding, is that Jesus is giving this new commandment in the context of a new covenant. And so that we get on the Last Supper, we get in Luke, and I believe in Mark, we get in the Eucharistic feast, a new covenant in his blood. And so he understands the commandment in a covenantal question, just as the commandments, the commandments in the Hebrew tradition grow out of the Mosaic covenant that came from Mount Sinai. That this is a recasting of Hebrew understandings that Jesus is doing, and that new commandment. I mean, the word for new in Greek is actually not new; it's renew.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he's giving them a renewed commandment, and he is articulating that commandment in a different way. And so we already have the commandment to love God with all your heart and your mind and your soul, and the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself in Leviticus 19. And I think in the Synoptic Gospels, the commandment to love, the so-called summary of the law, all of which is in the Hebrew Scriptures, the difference is that Jesus gives a greater emphasis on the syllable. But here he emphasizes on a different syllable and makes that commandment more particular and says to love like I love, which is, sacrificially, expecting nothing in return kind of love. And that's the love they are to have for one another. This is not an overarching love for everybody. He's talking about, this is an inner love for the people that Jesus has chosen. Because in John's gospel, Jesus chooses his followers.
I'm with you. I don't think it's exclusive to them, of course. I mean, I think in the end it's for the whole world, right? I mean, this is cosmic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the tensions here in this love question, in the new commandment love question. And so we would get the question of, what is Jesus doing with this new commandment? And this is where you put like Johannine glasses on, or glasses of the whole Gospels together. Most assuredly, we have our lives dedicated to the synoptic understanding that we are to love God with all our heart and our mind and our soul, and our neighbor as ourselves. I mean, that's the Hebrew understanding that Jesus summarizes. And that is, in some sense, the way we, certainly in the Episcopal Church, understand our job, so to speak. But I think that one of the tensions in John's Gospel is that that's not exactly what the Johannine Jesus is saying. He is saying, where I am going, you cannot come. But if you want to keep me, the way you keep me in your midst is to love one another as I have loved you. And then out of keeping that mutual love for one another in Jesus' love, that Jesus' love then spills into the world and loves God and loves neighbor as self. But it starts, I mean, the constitutive element in John's community is this Jesus love, which then spills out into the world. Right. But it is nuanced and different.
Yeah. And he says in the beginning, you will see greater things than these. So maybe that follows here too. But with this foot washing, it's a profoundly human gesture, and it's so embedded in their culture that it would be much more powerful for them at first hearing than it is for us in the doing and the hearing about, because we don't do that to each other. But if we get our heads around what it meant in the first century and ancient world, there's so many levels on which foot washing is important, and we hear them every year. We know about like the servants do the foot washing, not the host. Right. It's a gesture of hospitality and welcome, and it's comforting. It's such a relief at the end of a dusty trail, and with their sandals on and everything. So here Jesus is putting on the servant role, and yet he's also the host of this feast that he's welcoming them into. So I think that's the most low-hanging fruit of what he's doing. He's becoming their servant and showing them that that's how they're one way in which they're to love. And then another way that I heard through James Allison was that the one appropriate person that a host would wash would be his spouse, his wife. And it would be a gesture.
I've never heard that.
Yeah. And so the host could wash her feet as a gesture of intimacy, respect, humility, equality. And so Jesus is doing some kind of spousal gesture. And of course, we refer to the brides, the church as the bride of Christ.
Oh, wow.
And
interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was super beautiful.
Super off the chart for me. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, well, it's one of the many layers of John, I think he gets it all. And then a third thing, if you don't mind,
far away,
is that Jesus puts himself at, under their feet. There's the position, we've already talked about this, when kings were victorious in the Psalms, we call it, or, the proclamation is, and he put his enemies under his feet, right. And then of course, as we mentioned, that Jesus quotes Psalm 41 afterwards, that even my bosom friend whom I trusted lifted his heel against me. So Jesus knows he's putting himself in this position. He knows not all the people's feet whom he's washing. He knows that they're not all going to stay by him. Judas is about to go to betray him. Peter's about to deny him. They're all about to kind of fall away. And I guess part of following Jesus in this way, loving and serving one another, is agreeing to serve dangerously and knowing, not everyone you serve is going to accept it or even treat you well, or they might even use it against you, And I think that that's a third thing. And then the fourth thing is this idea that it's an ordination gesture, because Levites and high priests were washed in order to become the priest. And that's where James Allison talks about Peter's response. Oh, then in that case, wash my whole body. He not only wants to share Jesus' priesthood, he wants to be a high priest, And it's not exactly what he's saying, but that's why Peter could be possibly be saying, oh, I get it, then wash my whole self. Because Jesus is offering their share in his priesthood. So, I mean, there's a lot of symbolism in the washing. Not any one of them is the whole of it, but
yeah, really interesting. I like the way you've just brought a litany of layering to take a look at this. I'm very reminded of my sabbatical, where I was in many places very dirty feet whirled, and took in many daily to enter people's homes or restaurants. We all took our shoes off everywhere.
Yeah.
So, I mean, taking your shoes off was a major part of it. In fact, to enter into one of the chapels, I don't know, you would call it a chapel, at the Dalai Lama's compound, everybody takes their shoes off, and I had that funny sign that I showed when I was reviewing that with the congregation, a sign that said, make sure your shoes are not stolen, which I thought was super low. Who's going to steal your shoes at the Dalai Lama's chapel? But anyway, dirty feet are still a big part in many places in the world. I think that the true signs of spiritual maturity are humility and service. These are two of the signs. And this humility and service is not dependent upon reactivity of the people who you serve. And then we get into just a note on the question of Peter. I find myself constantly the Petrine defender, and that this is the same Peter that we meet at Caesarea Philippi, who says, you're the Christ, and then makes the comment, no, this is never going to happen. And then the get behind me Satan story, which is not in John's gospel. But we have that sort of here again, where Peter's like, no way, boss, it's not happening. Right. And then he finds out if it's not happening, he's not part of the team. And he's like, okay, this impetuous Peter. So, I mean, I think
he's all in.
He's all in. And I think the resonances of some of the disciples like Peter through time, I mean, it's super cool. Well,
he gets it right away. It's just that he needs a minute. I mean, I think Jesus has to explain it.
Yeah.
And he's clarifying for everybody who comes after him too.
Yeah. Well, I think that I think that basically what we have here is a story of love. It's love on display. That's how Jesus begins the final and great teaching. It's about love. Yeah. That's a good place to end, I think, for this year's Maundy Thursday. And thanks for hanging in with us. And we're not done yet. We have our voicemail, and then Rob's going to come out from behind the camera and announce our T-shirt winner. He's got a good T-shirt on today too, don't you think, Peter? Always.
Thank you for the theology I learned today. This is Wayne Goodling calling from South Bend, Indiana. The kingdom of God can be compared to a farmer who sowed seed on the ground. The Gospel of John can be compared to a rich cheesecake. Father, Peter, thank you for making me laugh. Anything that makes one laugh is probably a good thing. I really get so much out of your podcast. Thanks again.
All right, Wayne, I love that, Wayne. I feel like saying, blessed is the one who laughs at our podcast. The beatitude out of these podcasts on the cheesecake comment.
That's great.
When we talked about the cheesecake comment later, which was something that just came out of me. I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about it. We were going to do each of the Gospels as a different food group. So, Wayne, we'll have to get back to you as we move through the Gospels and talk about each of the Gospels.
Yeah. Thanks for calling. We love that. That's really
that's
great.
The best.
And we love these comments. So if you'd like to call and give us a thought like Wayne did, call us at 203-442-5002. And now we've got Rob to give us our
Now, I hope we have a little drum roll action here that Rob's got to put in over the top here.
We have a track.
As Rob tries to get...
We need cheers like, wow.
Standing room only. Rob Schwartz from behind the camera in front of the camera. Take it away, Rob.
Ooh, I love the fanfare. I get on that. All right. It was fun being able to do a T-shirt contest. And I said to Peter, I said, now I've set a dangerous precedent for the podcast. We're going to have to give away more swag. But it was really neat to read and hear what people had to say about the gospel reading for that day. And we actually ended up with two winners. Both were really good, and it was kind of hard to decide between both. So we said, okay, we got to get another T-shirt and send that along as well. So our two winners are Don Tharp and Eric Rodriguez. So Don and Eric, congratulations, and we will be in touch and we'll send those T-shirts out to you. And I'll give this back over to Peter so he can talk. But thank you again for engaging with the gospel and engaging with us, and really kind of wrestling with what it's saying to you and means to you, and the message that comes out of it. So thank you.
Rob, you're the man from behind the camera, in front of the camera, behind the camera, around the camera, in every place with the T-shirt. And love Don and Eric. Thank you so much. Don and Eric, I mean, this is big for us. You know, you're our first swag people here, you know, so.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you are having a very holy week, and we'll look forward to more to come.